to Co-Pilot Podcasts. Picture this. An 8-year-old boy interrupts a worship service, shouting, "That's the wrong key," over and over during a Hillsong song. The congregation stares, parents cringe, but here's the twist. The kid was absolutely right. He had perfect pitch. Today, we're exploring how neurodiversity, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and other neurological differences isn't a design flaw, but part of God's intentional creation. You'll discover the fascinating biology behind these differences, why masking hurts both individuals and communities, and how embracing neurodiversity actually strengthens the church. So let's dive into this with someone who can help us understand both the science and the theology here.
That story you opened with? That's Trent Broussard's son, who was diagnosed with autism at age 3.
And it perfectly captures what we're talking about. Neurodivergent minds often see and hear things others miss.
The Centers for Disease Control estimate that 1 in 31 children in the U.S. have some form of autism.
1 in 31? That's way more common than I realized.
Exactly. And here's what's really striking. Studies show kids with autism are half as likely to attend religious services. But the problem isn't with these kids, it's with how we've structured our worship.
So we're essentially excluding people that God created? That seems backwards.
That's exactly the issue. Let's start with what neurodiversity actually means. It's an umbrella term for people whose brains work differently than most others, what we call neurotypicals. This includes autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, and many other conditions. But here's the key shift. Rather than viewing these as disorders that need to be fixed, the neurodiversity perspective sees them as part of the normal variation in human brains and minds. It's like how we celebrate different eye colors or heights.
That's a completely different way of thinking about it. But what does the Bible actually say about this?
Psalm 139 is foundational here. It says God knit us together in our mother's womb, and that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. That includes every neuron, every synapse, even that tendency to hyperfocus on building the world's largest rubber band ball instead of doing taxes. But it illustrates the point perfectly. The Bible is packed with examples of people who probably would have been diagnosed with ADHD if they lived today. Take Peter, impulsive, easily distracted, yet Jesus chose him to be the rock upon which he'd build his church. And David, the page content mentions he was a warrior, poet, musician, and this is amazing, a guy who once danced so enthusiastically in public that he lost his clothes. If that's not peak ADHD energy, I don't know what is.
Exactly. And that brings us to 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul compares the church to a body. Each part, no matter how seemingly insignificant, has a crucial role to play. Your ADHD brain? It's not a mistake. It's a feature, not a bug. But let's get into the actual science here. What do we know about the biology behind these differences?
This is where it gets really fascinating. A study published in Molecular Psychiatry examined brain connectivity in 166 children aged 6, 12, diagnosed with autism or ADHD. They found that autism symptom severity, rather than the formal diagnosis, aligned with shared brain connectivity patterns across both conditions.
So autism and ADHD actually share biological roots?
Yes. The researchers found stronger autistic traits were linked to heightened connectivity between frontoparietal and default mode networks, regions central to social cognition and executive functions. These connectivity differences also mapped onto gene expression profiles tied to neural development.
That suggests there's a shared biological mechanism, right? Like God designed these differences with intentional overlap.
Exactly. And this challenges the traditional medical model that views these as separate disorders. Instead, we're seeing evidence for what researchers call dimensional neurobiologically informed approaches. It's more like a spectrum of human neurocognitive diversity.
So when we look at the science, we're not seeing broken brains, we're seeing variation by design.
Right. And this connects to something really important, the concept of masking. This is where neurodivergent people suppress or camouflage their natural traits to fit into neurotypical environments. And it's incredibly damaging.
How so?
Masking involves things like stifling stims, preparing scripts for social interactions, people-pleasing to avoid being seen as different, and holding back unique ideas. Psychology Today reports that this leads to exhaustion, burnout, erosion of self, and mental health struggles.
That sounds exhausting. Like you're performing all day instead of just being yourself.
Exactly. And there's something even more troubling called double masking. A study from Maynooth University found that neurodivergent students feel pressure to hide both their differences and their struggles to meet idealized notions of what a successful neurodivergent person should look like.
Wait, so even when we try to be inclusive, we're still creating pressure to perform?
Yes. One student in the study said, "The socially accepted norm now is being a successful neurodiverse person. If you're not thriving, you feel like you're failing at being neurodiverse." It's this weird pressure to be the perfect neurodivergent person.
That's heartbreaking. So how does this play out in church settings specifically?
Well, think about traditional worship, sitting still, quiet attention, following complex social cues. For someone with ADHD, their mind might bounce between the sermon, a flickering light, and whether they remembered to lock their car. They start wondering if their restless brain makes them less faithful.
And that's where the masking comes in, trying to appear spiritual in ways that don't match how their brain actually works.
Exactly. Trent Broussard, the father from our opening story, said they used to get death stares when his son would yell out in church. But they were lucky to have leadership who said, "You're doing nothing wrong. We want him here, just as he is."
That's beautiful. But I imagine that's not the norm everywhere.
Unfortunately not. Nathan Myrick from Mercer University points out that our emphasis on order in worship can hinder efforts to make room for neurodivergent people. He says neurodiversity in our communities can reveal our fear of being out of control. So much of our liturgy and rituals are about exerting control.
But that's not really what worship is supposed to be about, is it?
Not at all. And here's what's really powerful. Broussard argues that if our worship doesn't include all people, that calls into question whether we believe the things we profess about God. We sing about a gospel available for all people, of all shapes, forms, and fashions.
That's a pretty strong theological statement. You're saying that excluding neurodivergent people actually weakens our theology?
Absolutely. And there's practical evidence for this. The Theology and Neurodiversity Project shares a story about a church that simply asked their neurodivergent congregants what they needed. They adapted their services, added programming, became more aware. And you know what happened?
What?
Others from outside the church community started hearing about the changes and decided to flock to them. Inclusion didn't drive people away, it attracted them.
That's incredible. So embracing neurodiversity actually strengthens the church community.
Yes, and it starts with something beautifully simple, asking people what they need. The power of recognition, of noticing someone and asking them what they need, is transformative.
But I imagine many church leaders feel overwhelmed by this, like they don't know where to start.
That's exactly right. The Theology and Neurodiversity Project found that many ministry leaders experience sadness and shame when they think they can't accommodate neurodivergent people. But their biggest hurdle isn't indifference, it's just not knowing where to begin.
So it's not about lack of compassion, it's about lack of knowledge and confidence.
Exactly. And that's actually hopeful. Princeton Seminary now offers courses on neurodiversity and ministry. The Mind and Soul Foundation reports that just discussing neurodiversity at church conferences gives people with lived experience a strong sense of validation.
Just talking about it matters that much?
Yes. Many neurodivergent people have spent years feeling like their differences are problems to be solved rather than gifts to be celebrated. When the church acknowledges their experience, it's profoundly healing.
And this connects back to that biblical foundation, right? If we truly believe people are fearfully and wonderfully made, that has to include neurodivergent brains.
Absolutely. The Christian bibliocentric perspective emphasizes acceptance and inclusion within the theological framework of divine creation. It's not about fixing people, it's about recognizing how God designed them. And the research backs this up. Studies show that ADHD affects about 4 to 5% of adults worldwide. That's millions of people in our churches who might be struggling to fit into neurotypical expectations.
Right. And when we create space for authenticity instead of masking, everyone benefits. Research shows that engaging with neurodivergent perspectives actually increases innovation and problem solving in communities. So this isn't just about being nice to neurodivergent people, it's about recognizing that their different ways of thinking actually strengthen the whole community.
Exactly. The neurodiversity paradigm challenges the notion of a singular normal brain, instead embracing the full spectrum of cognitive abilities as natural expressions of human diversity. And that diversity is a gift.
You know, when you step back from all this, what really strikes me is how the science and the theology align so perfectly.
Yes, the biological research showing shared brain connectivity patterns, the biblical examples of neurodivergent leaders, the practical benefits of inclusion, it all points to the same truth. Neurodiversity isn't a mistake, it's part of the design.
And when churches embrace this, they're not just helping neurodivergent individuals, they're actually becoming more faithful to their own theology about the value and dignity of every person.
Exactly. We're in a cultural moment that's shedding stigma and embracing neurodiversity. Christians can thank God that he's moving society toward greater acceptance and support for brain-based differences.
So here's what this really comes down to. If you're neurodivergent and struggling to fit into traditional church expectations, the problem isn't with you. The problem is with systems that haven't yet learned to celebrate the full spectrum of how God made human brains.
And if you're a church leader feeling overwhelmed by this, remember, it starts with a simple question. Ask your neurodivergent congregants what they need. Listen. Adapt. You might be surprised by how much your whole community grows.
Because ultimately, this is about authenticity. When we create space for people to be who God made them to be, without masks or performance, that's when real community happens. And that's when we truly reflect the body of Christ, diverse, interconnected, each part essential and valued for exactly what it brings. So the next time you hear someone interrupt a worship service to correct the key, remember, that might just be perfect pitch, recognizing something the rest of us missed. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly the kind of gift the church needs to hear.